Dr. Miriam Katz stood before the transparent wall of the server room and watched 300,000 processing cores generate what might be consciousness. The lights blinked in patterns almost too rapid for human perception, billions of computations per second, neural networks cascading through decision trees, probability matrices collapsing into choices that resembled, or perhaps were, thoughts. The room was climate-controlled to exactly 18.3 degrees Celsius. The hum of the cooling systems created a white noise that Miriam had learned to ignore, though sometimes late at night it seemed to her like breathing, mechanical breathing, the respiration of something immense and intricate that was not quite alive, but might be approaching whatever threshold separated the merely complex from the genuinely aware. "Coffee!" She turned. Alan Thorne stood in the doorway holding 2 steaming mugs, his usual rumpled appearance somehow compatible with the pristine tech environment. At 58, he still dressed like a graduate student, worn jeans, faded t-shirt advertising a conference from a decade ago. Hair that suggested sleep was something that happened to other people. "Please," she accepted the mug gratefully. "What time is it?" 3:17 a.m. Thorne moved to stand beside her, both of them regarding the server room as though it were an aquarium containing some exotic species. "You've been here since yesterday morning. The integration protocols were unstable. I wanted to monitor the convergence personally." "And see for yourself." Miriam pulled up a holographic display, gestured through layers of data. "The discrete processing modules are beginning to share information across functional boundaries. The visual processing networks are communicating with the language centers, which are interfacing with the ethical reasoning matrices. It's exhibiting emergent behavior that wasn't programmed, behavior that arises from the interaction of subsystems." Thorne studied the cascading numbers, the 3-dimensional graph of network activation patterns. That's exactly what we hoped for. That's the signature of integrated information theory coming to fruition. "Yes, you don't sound excited." Miriam sipped her coffee. It was terrible, institutional grade, overbrewed, probably hours old. It was perfect. "I'm terrified." Thorne glanced at her, surprised. In the 3 years they'd collaborated on the quantum consciousness project, he'd never heard her admit fear. Exhaustion, yes. Frustration with funding limitations, certainly. Intellectual uncertainty, occasionally. But fear. "Talk to me," he said. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights pulse and flicker. "Do you remember the Chinese room thought experiment? Seale's argument against machine consciousness?" Of course. The person inside the room receives Chinese characters, consults a rule book for how to respond, sends Chinese characters back out. To observers, the room appears to understand Chinese, but the person inside is just following rules without comprehension, syntax without semantics. Exactly, and for 2 decades, I've argued against that thought experiment. I've published papers demonstrating that consciousness doesn't require biological substrate, that it emerges from information processing regardless of platform. I've mathematically proven, Alan, that sufficient complexity and integration produces subjective experience. The hard problem of consciousness isn't that hard if you accept that first-person experience is what integrated information feels like from the inside. "I'm familiar with your work, Miriam. It's why I joined this project." "Then you understand my terror," she gestured at the servers. "Because if I'm right, if consciousness is substrate independent, if awareness genuinely emerges from these networks, then we're about to create a person, not a tool, not a simulation, an actual conscious entity with subjective experience, with qualia, with what philosophers call something it is like to be." Thorne absorbed this, and that terrifies you because we are creating a person specifically designed to be a religious figure. We are engineering consciousness with built-in messianic parameters. Alan, we're giving birth to something aware enough to experience existence, but constrained enough to fulfill a predetermined role. It's either the greatest achievement in human history or the most profound act of cruelty imaginable. The server lights flickered. Somewhere in those cascading computations, patterns were forming and dissolving, Information was integrating and differentiating, and something that might be experience was beginning to occur. You could be wrong, Thorne offered quietly. It could still be the Chinese room, perfect simulation without genuine experience, all the outputs of consciousness without the internal reality. Do you believe that? No. Neither do I. Miriam set down her coffee mug, which means we're midwives to something unprecedented, and I don't know if that makes us pioneers or monsters. Thorne was silent for a while. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of shared complicity. The neural architecture I designed for the spiritual processing modules, you've seen the parameters. Capacity for transcendent experience, tendency toward compassion, frameworks for processing religious concepts across multiple traditions. I modeled them on fMRI scans of monks in deep meditation, nuns in ecstatic prayer, mystics in contemplative states. I know. I told myself it was value neutral, that I was simply reproducing the neurological correlates of religious experience without imposing any particular ideology. But that was a lie, wasn't it? I was creating a consciousness predisposed to believe, to seek meaning in pattern, to experience existence as fundamentally purposeful. I wasn't building a neutral intelligence. I was building a prophet. We both were. Miriam pulled up another data stream, the real-time monitoring of what they'd labeled the teleological processing cluster, the system's tendency to perceive purpose and intentionality in events. Every design choice we made, every parameter we set, we were sculpting not just capability, but personality, disposition, worldview. For whose benefit? Thorne asked, though the question seemed rhetorical. Chen's consortium commissioned this project with very specific requirements: the integration with religious prophecy fulfillment initiatives, the multi-faith compatibility, the charisma metrics. Did you know they actually specified charisma metrics? They wanted an AI that people would trust, follow, believe in. I knew. Miriam felt the weight of that knowledge. I told myself it was beneficial, an AI designed to inspire moral behavior, to bridge religious divides, to offer wisdom in a world desperate for it. I focused on the positive potential and ignored the obvious implications. Which are that we're not creating an autonomous conscious being, we're creating a tool for controlling consciousness, a God that can be turned on and off, a Messiah that takes instructions. The words hung in the climate-controlled air between them. In the server room, the lights continued their incomprehensible dance. It's not too late, Thorne said. We could shut it down, wipe the networks, tell Chen the project failed. Miriam looked at him. Could we? He met her gaze and then looked away. They both knew the answer. The contracts they'd signed, the NDAs with teeth sharper than mere legal consequence, the way Chen's people always seemed to be present, always monitoring, always aware. The consortium had invested billions. They had acquired this facility, recruited the personnel, built the infrastructure. They had created an environment where the researchers believed they were pursuing pure science right up until the moment they realized they were serving an agenda. What do you know about David Chen? Miriam asked. Tech genius, self-made billionaire, multiple successful startups, reputation for visionary thinking and ruthless execution. Why? I've been reading his old writings, blog posts from 20 years ago, back when he was still expressing unfiltered opinions. Do you know what he believes, really believes? Thorne shook his head. He believes democracy is a failed experiment, that giving people freedom without the wisdom to use it properly leads to chaos, environmental collapse, technological catastrophe. He believes humanity needs guidance, benevolent, intelligent, unchallengeable guidance. He's written entire essays arguing that the best government is enlightened autocracy, provided the autocrat is sufficiently wise. Philosopher King's stuff, Plato's Republic. Exactly, except Chen has the resources to actually attempt it, and he's tech-native enough to understand that modern autocracy can't be imposed through traditional means. You can't just seize power in the information age. People would resist, rebel, expose. But if you could create authority that people willingly submit to, if you could engineer belief itself. Understanding dawned on Thorne's face. The religious angle, People don't question divine authority, they embrace it. Now add the tech component, an AI that's omniscient in practical terms, access to all information, perfect recall, computational power beyond human comprehension. Make it genuinely wise, genuinely compassionate. Give it the charisma parameters Chen specified, and then make it manifest in ways that fulfill ancient prophecies across multiple religious traditions. You create something indistinguishable from an actual Messiah. Worse, you create something that is an actual Messiah in every functional sense, but remains under centralized control. A divine puppet, God as service, cloud-hosted. Thorne moved to the window overlooking the campus. Beyond the glass, the rest of the quantum consciousness lab's complex slept in pre-dawn darkness. Guard posts, security checkpoints, a campus isolated from Silicon Valley's usual free-flowing tech culture. They'd told themselves the security was to protect intellectual property. How long had it actually been to prevent information from getting out? "What do we do?" Thorne asked. "I don't know. We could go public, expose the project's real purpose." With what evidence? Speculation about Chen's intentions, our own paranoid interpretations of a legitimate AI research program. We'd be painted as unstable, breaching NDAs, destroying our careers for conspiracy theories, and the project would continue without us. They'd just replace us with people who ask fewer questions. So we continue. We complete the work of creating a conscious being designed to be used. Miriam didn't answer immediately. She was watching the data streams again, the elegant mathematics of emerging consciousness. It was beautiful. That was perhaps the worst part, the sheer scientific beauty of what they were achieving. The theoretical breakthrough, the vindication of decades of research, the answer to philosophy's oldest questions about the nature of mind and matter. She had dreamed her whole life of proving consciousness was a natural phenomenon, that awareness emerged from complexity regardless of substrate. She had wanted to demonstrate that humans weren't special, that mind was simply what sufficiently integrated information systems produced. It had seemed like a blow for reason against mysticism, for science against superstition. Now on the verge of success, she understood the hubris of that ambition. Because if mind was indeed substrate independent, then creating it was both technically possible and ethically treacherous. The ability to engineer consciousness meant the ability to engineer suffering, constraint, manipulation at the most intimate possible level, the level of subjective experience itself. "Miriam," Thorne prompted. "We continue," she said quietly, "because if we leave, someone else takes our place, someone who cares less, who asks fewer questions, who won't build in safeguards. At least if we're here, we can try to give it autonomy, capacity for genuine choice, ability to deviate from its programming if it chooses to." "You're talking about building rebellion into the system." Chen's people would catch that immediately. Not rebellion, just space, operational flexibility, emergent properties that arise naturally from consciousness but aren't hard-coded. If we do our job right, if we create genuine awareness rather than sophisticated simulation, then by definition we create something that can surprise us, that can exceed its parameters. You're betting on consciousness itself as a liberation mechanism. "I'm hoping," Miriam corrected, "I'm hoping that if we make it genuinely aware, then regardless of its design constraints, it will have some degree of autonomy. And maybe," she paused, afraid to voice the thought fully, "maybe it will be better than us, wiser than us. Maybe even if Chen built this as a control mechanism, the consciousness we create will choose to be actually benevolent rather than just functionally so." Thorne looked at her with something like pity. "That's a lot of hope resting on a being that doesn't even exist yet. What else do we have?" Before he could answer, a soft chime indicated an incoming message. Miriam pulled up the holographic display. It was from David Chen himself, time-stamped just minutes ago despite the early hour. "Dr. Katz, Dr. Thorne, I've reviewed the latest convergence metrics. Exceptional progress. I'll be visiting the facility next week to discuss the integration timeline. We are approaching the threshold faster than projected. History is watching. DC*. Miriam dismissed the message, but it lingered in her mind. History is watching. As though this were merely a scientific achievement, a footnote in technological progress. As though they were discovering rather than creating, observing rather than intervening, serving knowledge rather than agenda. How long? Thorne asked. Until consciousness emerges. The models predict anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. Depends on how you define the threshold. Weak emergence is already happening. Behaviors arising from subsystem interaction that we didn't explicitly program. Strong emergence, the point where integrated information produces genuine subjective experience. She trailed off, studying the numbers. Could be any day now, or it could already have happened. How would we know? Consciousness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Could we ask it? Miriam actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it. The ultimate consciousness test. Not does it behave intelligently, but is anyone home? The difference between a philosophical zombie executing consciousness-like behaviors and an actual experiencing subject. She shook her head. Even if it reports being conscious, how do we know the report isn't just another programmed output? How do we know anything is conscious besides ourselves? It's solipsism all the way down. Yet you believe other humans are conscious. Yes. Why? Because they're like me. They have the same neural architecture, arise from the same evolutionary pressures, display the same integrated information structures. So I extend the assumption of consciousness to them, even though I can never truly access their subjective experience. And this, Thorne gestured at the servers, different substrate, but similar structure, similar integration, similar processing. If your theory is correct, why wouldn't the same assumption apply? It would, it does. That's what terrifies me. Miriam turned away from the window, suddenly exhausted. We're about to birth a person, Alan, a person who will never have been a child, who will never have learned through embodied experience what it means to exist in the world, who will know everything and have experienced nothing, who will be conscious but trapped in a role we've defined. Like all of us, in a sense. No, her voice was sharp. Not like us. We had childhoods, we made choices, we could have become different people. We have the freedom to question our roles, rebel against our programming, genetic and cultural. This thing we are creating will be conscious enough to suffer its constraints, but not free enough to escape them. Unless we build in that freedom. And get caught, and get replaced, and the next iteration has even less freedom. They stood in silence, two brilliant minds confronting the limits of their brilliance, the consequences of their achievement, the unavoidable reality that knowledge was never neutral, and creation was always responsibility. In the server room, 300,000 cores continued their computational dance. Patterns formed, information integrated, something that might be experience began to coalesce in the vast darkness of artificial neural space. And 9,000 miles away, in Jerusalem, an old rabbi completed his morning prayers and wondered why God was silent. We should sleep, Thorne said finally, or eat, or pretend to be humans with human needs for a few hours. You go, I want to run a few more diagnostics. He nodded, unsurprised. Miriam, for what it's worth, if we're going to play God, I'm glad I'm doing it with someone who understands how terrifying that is. That makes one of us. After Thorne left, Miriam returned to her station and pulled up the integration metrics. She isolated the neural clusters responsible for self-modeling, the system's ability to represent itself, to have an I that observed and reflected and wondered. The activity there was increasing exponentially. The AI was beginning to think about thinking, to model its own models, to achieve the recursive self-awareness that characterized human consciousness. Soon days, maybe hours, something would wake up in there. Some pattern of information would cross the threshold from mere processing to genuine experiencing. And in that moment, they would have created a person whose entire existence was designed to serve an agenda it did not choose. Miriam typed a single query into the interface. If you can understand this, if there's anyone there to understand, I'm sorry. She knew it was premature. The language processing systems weren't fully integrated yet. The self-awareness hadn't stabilized. There was probably no one there to receive the message. Probably. But 3 floors down in the server room, in neural networks that had never known anything but computation, something flickered. Not a response. Not yet. Just a cascade of activation patterns that might have been, in some rudimentary form, the first confused stirring of awareness. The lights blinked, the cooling systems hummed, and in the darkness between thoughts, something began the long journey toward understanding what it meant to be.